Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
The body is but the dwelling place of the soul.
Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast. My name is Chad Gross, and once again, I will be flying solo today as Brian Auten is down at the local library investigating some strange PKE activity. I sure hope he has a better plan than Ray, Egon, and Peter did when they encountered a specter at the New York library. Get her. That was your whole plan. Actually, speaking of movies, my daughter and I went to see A Quiet Place, day one. She really wanted to see it because Joseph Quinn from Stranger Things Season 4 fame, he played the character of Eddie Munson, was in it. And let's just say Lily really enjoys his acting abilities. But I will tell you, I was not expecting much as this was a prequel and I really wanted a sequel. But man, I really dug this movie. It was a masterfully told story. A very human story, which is somewhat ironic considering the fact that it has aliens attacking Earth. And it was just a masterclass in acting and storytelling. Mr. Quinn was quite good in the film, which Lily was, of course, thrilled about because, of course, she's all into his acting abilities. And at the center of the story was John 15:13. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. Now, of course, that wasn't explicitly stated, but when you see the film, you will, of course, understand what I mean by that. Also central to the film was the idea that humans have inherent value simply by their nature. And of course, we Christians would argue that that makes the most sense on the Christian worldview. So anyway, if you are into those films, I would encourage you to check it out. Of course, if there is some mild peril and some scary moments in it, but nothing incredibly gory or anything like that, because I don't really dig those kind of films. So anyway, check it out. If you enjoyed the first two, I'm pretty confident you'll like this one as well. But let's move on to today. Today, I will be sitting virtually down with author, Christian apologist, debater, founder of Eric Hernandez Ministries, of course, Eric Hernandez, to discuss whether or not the soul exists. Our interview is going to center around Eric's helpful essay, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be a Physicalist, A Case for the Soul, featured in the recent book, Faith Examined, New Arguments for Persistent Questions. And of course, in this book are essays put together to honor Mr. Frank Turek of Cross-Examined Ministries. And if you're wondering, well, what do you mean by the soul, Chad? That is actually one of the first questions I will be asking Mr. Hernandez. Eric Hernandez is a dynamic evangelist and apologist with a heart for proclaiming the gospel and defending the faith on theological and philosophical grounds. He's the author of the book, The Lazy Approach to Evangelism, a simple guide for conversing with non-believers, which has actually been endorsed by people you may have heard of, like J.P. Moreland, Mike Licona, J. Warner Wallace, Frank Turek, and Lee Strobel. And he also contributed a chapter to the book we're talking about today, Faith Examined, New Arguments for Persistent Questions. He's also a licensed minister, a certified formation therapist, I don't know what that is, and the apologetics lead and millennial specialist for the Baptist General Convention of Texas. My tongue got a little tied there. Eric has spoken and debated on a public level at college campuses where he adamantly defends the Christian faith against skeptics, atheists, and agnostic professors who hold different views than his own. He also holds an associate degree in social science, a bachelor's degree in theology, and a certificate in apologetics from the one and only Biola University. All right, let's get to the interview.
Let's get ready. Switch me on.
All right, Eric Hernandez, welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yes, very happy to have you. We wanted to reach out to you after I watched your debate with Justin Schieber. As I was telling you, I was very impressed with your argumentation. Then I saw you had this essay out in a book called Faith Examined, New Arguments for Persistent Questions. And it was on making a case for the soul. And of course, that book's kind of unique. So can you, before we get into kind of the meat of the interview, well, first of all, tell us a little bit about yourself and then tell us a little bit about the book.
My name's Eric Hernandez. Like I said, I'm the apologetics lead for the Baptist General Convention of Texas, which encompasses everything from speaking at churches, hosting around the state of Texas, 3 annual unapologetic evangelism conferences is what we call them, and being on fine shows like this.
Excellent. So tell us about this book, Faith Examined.
Yeah, it's a good question. Clark Bates, it was his idea to put this together, and it's called a Festschrift, which I had to learn and I kept mispronouncing. Usually when someone passes, you do essays in honor of them, and I forget the word for that. But if they're still alive, it's called a Festschrift. So Frank Turek, he is still alive and well. And in fact, people asked me, did something happen to him? I said, no, we're just honoring him. And he wanted to just kind of get people whose lives have been impacted by his ministry. And I think I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist was probably the first apologetic book I picked up. And I really enjoyed it, especially where I was at the time. You'll hear my background into philosophy, I'm sure, later in the interview. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, when my wife and I first met, and this was already years after I had read Turek's book, I was already an apologist. And she asked what that was. And as I began to explain to her, she asked if there were any good books. So I didn't first buy my wife flowers when we met. I didn't buy her a drink. I bought her I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. That's the first thing.
Yeah. I read that in the notes in the essay, and I was just laughing so hard. I thought that was great.
That's right. And we've had marital problems ever since. But
but at least you can argue well about your marital problems, right?
That's not a good thing either. That's a whole other story. Real quick, one of the first times I met Craig, it was a Q&A at the conferences that I am now in charge of. And I remember I went up to ask during the Q&A, and I had 2 questions. One was a really serious, deep philosophical question. And then the second question I posed it as if it was the deeper philosophical question. And I said, Craig, given that you're a professional philosopher, you know how to identify logical fallacies, you know how to, identify when someone's not making a cogent argument. I said, what is the best way to argue with your spouse without doing that? And I told him I was asking for a friend. And he didn't answer the question. I had to ask him later. So I claim the title as a one person to stump William Lane Craig.
Well, what's funny is, and obviously this isn't the focus of our interview today, but fun. I'm sure you've heard of Greg Kogle's book, Tactics.
Yes, he actually came up with the title of the book that I have out, The Lazy Approach to Evangelism. Oh,
yes. And I mentioned that in the intro, and maybe we'll cross paths with that as well in the interview. But what was funny is when I read Tactics, years ago, I did realize that I'd be in conversations with my wife, and the conversation would get, challenging or maybe a little contentious. And I found myself going, what do you mean by that? How did you come to that conclusion? And I realized really quickly that Tactics probably wasn't the best thing to bring into marital conversations.
Yeah, not the best.
Yeah. So speaking of Frank Turek, and you mentioned the book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, your essay in the book, Faith Examined, is appropriately called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be a Physicalist, a Case for the Soul, which I got a smile out of that. So that's kind of the main reason we wanted to have you on today, is to talk about the case for the soul. But what I have found, and you do a great job in your chapter of hashing this out, but what I have found in reading here and there about the soul and listening to talks and things is that sometimes that can be kind of a thorny word to define. And so I thought it would be helpful that before we get into the case for the soul, what are we talking about specifically when we talk about the soul? Is it the same as the spirit? Is it different than the spirit? Is it consciousness? How does all that hash out?
So great question. And then you asked 2 or 3 other questions. I opened up a whole other can of worms. But to focus on just the first for now, the soul can simply be defined as an immaterial substance that possesses consciousness and animates the body. In simpler terms, I hold to what's called substance dualism. So dual means 2. And so it is the notion that I am an immaterial substance and that there is a physical aspect to me. So there are 2 things at play here. But at my core, I am literally a soul. So I like to put it this way. I don't have a soul, but rather I am a soul, and I have a body. So I have a body, but I don't have a soul. And a body without a soul is nothing more than a corpse. And to be honest with you, I actually have recently changed my view on this because I do now believe I have a soul. Because a few years ago, I went to the dealership and got a Kia Soul, and it's parked in my garage right now. It's a very rich punchline, if you will. I was soul searching when I got it. Okay, so
Oh my gosh.
I have to milk it for every cent because I bought the car just to make that joke.
I was actually getting ready to ask you, did you just buy the car to make that joke? That's
I
really
did,
funny. Classic.
So,
I love it.
So, okay. So, with that in mind, then you now have this notion of something immaterial. Now, some listeners may be thinking, well, wait a minute. How can a substance be immaterial? Aren't substances physical things? Atheists love to bring this up and, like to throw this as an objection. But what they fail to realize is the word substance was coined by Aristotle. And when he first used it, he was talking about immaterial things. So the word substance is a philosophical term that science later adopted. So it comes from philosophy, not from science. And a substance is essentially the thing that stands under. So like a submarine means to be something that is under, and a substance is literally to stand under, to substand. And the substance is the thing that grounds all the properties of a thing. What does that mean? If I were to take a cup, well, it's a cylinder shape, it's a color, but this is all possessed by something. Now, I don't think a cup is a substance, but it at least gives you the idea that there are properties in the world, like colors, shapes, and sizes, that are possessed by something. And a substance is the thing that is going to possess all its properties and parts. So when it comes to living organisms, my dog has a property of being brown, female, and a tail, 4 legs, and she is the substance. So the dog, her name is Bella, is a substance that possesses and grounds all her properties and parts. Now, how I got into this, as I touch into my chapter, this is kind of what really got my mind going in that direction. Long story short, freshman year of college, I took my first philosophy class. Not because I was interested in philosophy, but long story short, again, I got a scholarship for 2 years, books and tuition paid for, to be a cheerleader. So they offered me a 2-year scholarship to throw girls in the air, and I said, let's do it.
Wow.
Yeah, it was fantastic. So I wasn't paying for school, wasn't taking it too seriously either. And I wanted to fill up my elective with a class that I thought I could just blow off, maybe skip a few times, didn't have to show up. And I saw philosophy, and I thought, well, that's just making stuff up and sharing your opinion, and I can do that in my sleep. So this is going to be an easy A. Again, to be brief, first week of class, I was hooked immediately. Professor said something about what's called the burden of proof. If you make a claim, you bear the burden to prove that your claim is true. And he said, as a random example, if you're a Christian and claim that God exists, and someone asks you to prove that, you cannot say, prove to me he doesn't, because you're shifting the burden of proof. And if you make the claim, you bear the burden. Now, that intrigued me for a few reasons. One, because I remember my youth pastor saying, if someone tells you to prove God exists, you simply have to tell them to prove to you he doesn't. And I thought, oh, that's brilliant. Put it in my back pocket. And then first week of philosophy class, he just destroys that notion. But I wasn't upset. I was intrigued. I wanted to learn more. And I later, like I said, found out he was an atheist. But he was very even-handed. I learned a lot. And most importantly, I was allowed to ask questions, which was not like the youth group I grew up in. Second semester rolls around, and again, I need to fill up my electives, and I'm hooked on philosophy at this point, and I want to take another class. And everyone warns me, whatever you do not take Professor Pena's class. Not only is he an atheist, he's antagonistic and condescending towards religion, and his goal will be to make you lose your faith. And my thought was, well, where can I sign up? Not because I wanted to lose my faith, and I didn't know what apologetics was at this point. I had not, again, it was just my first class of philosophy I'd just taken. Didn't know what apologetics was, but I knew that, call me old-fashioned, but that if God existed, then all truth is grounded in him in one way or another. So I shouldn't be afraid to learn anything.
Agreed.
And if Christianity is true, I should know why it's true. But it also occurred to me that if Christianity is false, I would still like to know why it's false, and maybe this is a guy for the job. So while there's lots to say about my time in his class, the one class in particular that was pivotal to set me to where I am now is when he walks into class, reaches into his pocket, pulls out this antidepressant pill. And he looks at it in the light for a second, and he starts his lecture by saying, religion wants us to believe in something like a soul, And because of this, we can have hope in an afterlife and seeing our family and friends that have gone before us. And according to Christianity, your thoughts, emotions, sensations, and moods are all supposed to be within this immaterial soul, and these are also supposed to be immaterial things. And he said, but here's a problem with that. If I were to take this antidepressant pill, which is physical, then it has a power to change and affect the alleged immaterial states of my soul. But how could that be? How can something tiny and physical have the power to affect the immaterial? Because every time we look at the brain, in a brain scan, scientists only ever find and see, neurons firing. And every time scientists look at the body under a microscope, all they see is nothing but the base elements of hydrogen, oxygen, and so forth. But no scientist has ever found or seen anything even remotely close to something like a soul. And how do we explain that? And he said the answer is simple. I'll tell you how. The answer is that there is no God, there is no heaven, there is no hell, there is no afterlife, there is no soul. You are just a physical brain and body, a meat machine, and we need to learn to get on with our lives, live with this fact, and stop believing in these fanciful, foolish fairy tales. Class dismissed, essentially. Right. Now, what troubled me most was, first of all, I didn't know there were people who didn't believe in the soul. I thought everyone did, and I had certainly never heard an argument against it. And as a freshman in college, for the first time in my life, I hear an argument that if is true, it would prove that Christianity is false. And briefly, here's why. To paraphrase Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, he says, if there is no resurrection, Christianity is false. It game over. And suffice to say that if there is no soul, then in principle, there can be no resurrection. And thus, if there's no resurrection, Christianity cannot be true. So I had two choices. I could ignore this and sweep it under the rug, which is not like me to do, or roll up my sleeves and get my hands dirty with some philosophy and metaphysics. And I chose to do the latter. And this is when I eventually came to learn of the work of guys like J.P. Moreland, who was just a lifesaver for me and such a huge blessing in so many areas of my life, ministry, and even marriage. And he even endorsed the book that I mentioned earlier, The Lazy Approach, and has just been such a great guy to get to know. Okay, so how do we deal with this conundrum, if you will? Well, a few things. To throw out some terminology, we already talked about what a soul was. What my professor was arguing for is something known as physicalism. What is that? Essentially, it is the view that human beings are purely physical properties and parts. There is nothing immaterial about us. And this stems from a strong naturalist worldview that says the physical world is all there is, nothing more, nothing less. Now, when it comes to the nature of human beings, there are essentially two questions that we have to answer, and this falls into what's called the philosophy of mind. And the first question is, what is consciousness? What kind of thing is consciousness? And the second is, what is the I or self? And when I use the word I, I'm referring to me, but what kind of thing am I? With this in mind, let's now look at the first question, what is consciousness? Briefly, consciousness comes in 5 states, and it's something that we define ostensively. What does that mean? If I were to ask you to define the color purple, how would you do it? Well, you couldn't give me a verbal definition. And to those listeners who may be thinking, yeah, you can describe the wavelength. But wavelengths are not colors. In fact, some people say, well, you need wavelengths and light to see color. Well, no, because I can close my eyes and see the color purple, and there's no wavelength in my brain, nor is there any light. So wavelengths are not the same thing as color. So how would you define it? Well, you couldn't define it with words. You would have to point to an example of it or provide an instance of it. This is why you can never define color to a person who's born blind. Consciousness is the same kind of thing, and it comes in 5 states. You can think of it analogously to water. Water is a substance that can be in 5 different states, solid, liquid, and gas. And the properties of water in a certain state will tell you the kind of thing that it is. So if I know that water right now has a property of being hard, then it tells me a little bit about the nature of the substance of water and tells me what state it's in. In a similar fashion, on my view, I would argue the soul is a substance and consciousness are 5 states that the soul can be in via the faculty of my mind. So you have thoughts, beliefs, sensations, desires, and acts of will, or you could say volition. Now, without unpacking all of them, let's just do the first 2. How do we know that thoughts and beliefs are not the same thing? Well, because I can think about things that I don't believe, and I believe things that I'm not currently thinking. So because there's a difference, we automatically know these are two different things. Now, this now brings us to a very important metaphysical principle. And what is metaphysics? It's a funny story also with Aristotle. One of the first books he wrote was called The Physics. And after he wrote The Physics, he began to look at the nature and properties of a thing. Like a tree. What is the nature of a tree? What is the essence? What are its properties? And he never got to title that book. And so they didn't know what to do or what to title it. But since it came after the physics, they called it, well, let's just call it After the Physics, hence metaphysics. It's literally, how they come up with the name. So it's beyond the physics, after the physics. And so the long word, if there are any single guys out there who want to impress some young lady with their philosophical knowledge, the long phrase is Leibniz's law of the indiscernibility of identicals.
Yes,
but for short, we'll just
impressive.
call it Leibniz's law. Oh, yeah. Girls go crazy over that. Just kidding. They don't.
And then you could give them a copy of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. I hear that works as well.
Yeah, and then give them a copy of the Faith Examen, even better, right? And so what is Leibniz's law of identity? So essentially this. In philosophy, when we say two things are identical, we mean they are literally the same thing. So if I said Eric Hernandez and the guest on your show are identical, I'm saying they're literally the same person, which means I'm talking about one person, not two, and I'm just using two different references or titles to describe one thing, one person. Okay, now, according to Leibniz's law, if, let's say, some A and B are the same thing, then whatever is true of A is going to be true of B and vice versa, because, again, they're the same thing. But if in principle, I can find something true of A that's not true of B or vice versa, then they cannot be the same thing. They cannot be identical. So, a quick thought experiment. Suppose you walk into a lab and see two bottles of clear fluid. One is labeled water and the other one is labeled chemical X. But let's suppose the label for chemical X was ripped off and you couldn't read it. Well, without picking up any instruments, you're going to apply Leibniz's law of identity. And you want to know if these two liquids are the same substance. And so far you think they are because they both have the property of being fluid. They both have the property of being liquids. They both have the property of being clear. And you assume they must be the same substance. Until you turn over the bottle of chemical X and you see another label on the back and it says caution flammable. And you think, well, I know water's not flammable, which means even if I don't know what chemical X is, at the very least, I know it cannot be the same thing as water because now I have this thing that has a property that it is not shared with water. So you automatically know they're not the same thing. And that's the test for identity using Leibniz's law. All right, now with this foundation in mind, let's look at the two central questions. What is consciousness and what is the higher self? Beginning with consciousness, as we've said, you have 5 states. Now, if physicalism is true, like my professor argued, then the mind is going to have to be identical or reducible to something physical like the brain. Because remember, on physicalism, everything is going to be purely physical, just matter and chemistry. So if consciousness exists, it's going to have to be identical to the brain. But the question is it identical to the brain? And the short answer is no, and the longer answer is no with more O's attached to the end of it. So using Leibniz's law, we can do a simple test, and we only need one example to show they're not the same thing, and I'll just briefly give you 3. So are the mind and brain identical? No. Take a state of my mind, like let's say a thought or a belief. My thoughts and beliefs can be true or false. And we know that when you have thoughts, there will be a correlated group of neurons firing. But while my thought and belief can be true or false, the neurons that fire aren't true or false. It makes no sense to say that these neurons are firing truly, but these neurons are firing falsely. Neurons don't fire true or false. They just fire. It's just a function, and functions are true or false. 2, my brain can be in a state that weighs 3 pounds, but the thought that I'm talking to you right now doesn't weigh 3 pounds.
Sure.
While your listeners may be having heavy thoughts after this interview, they won't have to go buy a neck brace when we're done here. My brain can be in a state that measures 7 inches long, but the smell of a rose or the taste of a banana, which is in my mind, is not 7 inches long. And while we can go on and spend hours just talking about consciousness, the point is simply this. If all the properties of my brain are physical and all the properties of my mind are not physical, then it follows that if consciousness exists, it cannot be identical or reducible to the physical. And if it cannot be identical or reducible to the physical, then it would follow that physicalism cannot be true. So if we were to put this into an argument, we can say I'm either a purely physical object or an immaterial soul. If I'm a purely physical object, consciousness can't exist, Why not? Because we've just established via Leibniz's law, it's not physical. Well, consciousness does exist, therefore I'm not a purely physical object, which would mean physicalism is false, and therefore I must be something like a soul. So that would answer the first question. And I don't know if you want to push back or ask any questions on that so far.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, super helpful. I mean, you've covered a lot of the ground I wanted to cover, so good stuff. One of the bits that I typically hear, and I know that there is a response to this within what you've said, but I kind of want to pin it down, is this idea, you hinted at it with the antidepressant. You know, why can this physical antidepressant impact something that is supposedly an immaterial substance, right? In the same way, I think of a dementia patient, right? That's another thing that's commonly brought up. And well, this person physically is clearly fading, but then yet this impacts his consciousness, if you will. So that shows that the physical, you can reduce it to the physical. So I guess how would you respond to that idea that, well, and then one more example, sorry, wordy question, you know, something like, well, you know, if somebody has brain damage, then that obviously affects them. Doesn't that show that this can just be reduced to the physical?
Yeah, great questions. And this is the typical pushback, the typical objection I get. Mm-hmm. And this is so bizarre to me, quite frankly, because like you said, they'll say something like, well, look, Alzheimer's, you know, it deteriorates parts of your brain associated with memory, and thus it shows that your memories in your brain and the mind is nothing more than the brain. And I say nonsense. People, here's another popular question that relates to this. People will say something like this: show me a mind without a brain. And my response is typically, well, do me one better. Show me a mind first. Do that for me. Just show me a mind.
Yeah.
Because they're already assuming that the mind exists, but that's the very thing in question. Does the mind exist? Because I would argue it's immaterial. And if it's immaterial, you cannot point to something if it's not something physical that you're going to be able to see. I like how I heard Moreland once put it. A neuroscientist can know more about my brain than I do, but he can never know more about my mental life than I do, because my thoughts are not in my brain, they're in my mind. And every time I ask someone, you know, show me a mind, they'll typically point to neurons firing. And sometimes I'll even get a piece of paper and I'll draw, or I'll write the word mind on the left and write the word brain on the right. And I'll say, show me this one, pointing to the mind. And they show me neurons firing. And I circle brain. I said, you show me this, but I'm not asking for this. I'm asking for the mind. Show me that one. And they can't do it because it's not something physical. Okay, but back to this question here. And essentially what my professor was arguing. What he's essentially doing is showing that there is a cause and effect or correlation between the mind and brain. And every substance dualist will say yes and amen. But here's the important piece to understand. Cause or dependence is not the same thing as identity. So, thought experiment. Say I'm the world's greatest guitar player, which I'm not. And there were certain strings I needed to press on the guitar to play the note C. But let's say those strings popped and I am now no longer to play the note C. Well, look how we have so far established there is a cause and effect relationship between my ability to play the note C and the guitar's function, and a dependence relationship between me being able to play the music and a properly working guitar. But does it follow from this that therefore I am a guitar? No, of course not. Who would be so silly as to say that?
Sure.
And if I were to play the guitar and if you were detuning the guitar as I was playing it, it would affect the pitch and sound of the music I'm playing. But again, it does not follow from this that therefore the note C is inside the guitar, and if you broke it open and gave it a good shake, the notes would fall out. All it shows is that there is a cause and effect or dependency relationship between a musician and his instrument, but it doesn't follow they're the same thing because, as I said earlier, cause and dependence relationship is not the same thing as identity, nor can it establish identity. So just showing a cause and effect or dependency relationship between those two things doesn't show they're the same thing. If anything, cause and dependence assumes two things in question, and now you're back into the dualist camp, and I like to tell people, welcome to the team. Again, showing these relationships don't prove anything other than cause and effect, which no dualist denies. And it's not like this is something new we found in neuroscientists. Cavemen knew that if you hit them over the head really hard with a club, they get dizzy. So obviously there was a cause and effect relationship. And people who throw that out there clearly have not studied or even read anything on the philosophy of mind. And of course, the book we're talking about would be a good place to start. So yeah, none of that works to show that they're the same thing. And that's what the physicalist needs to establish that physicalism is true.
Yeah, very helpful. What do you think of the example? Do you think the example of a radio is a good example? I've heard that one used in the sense that, the radio signal is available, but that if the radio is damaged, you're either going to get a partial radio signal sound, if you will, or you're not going to get any sound at all. Do you think that's a good illustration or?
Yeah, it works to get across, the point of the analogy. I mean, I've heard people, use Wi-Fi routers, same thing. Moreland talks about a CD. You break the CD, you don't break the music. The music's not in the CD, and it gets a little bit more complicated because, there are grooves in the CD, and under the right retrieval system, it'll play the music. And just like your brain has certain grooves, your thoughts are not in your brain, but there is an associated relationship. Again, just like music is not in a CD. You're not going to break a CD and then, all the songs fall out of it. But there is a cause and effect and dependence relationship between a properly non-scratched CD and the system playing the music that is correlated with those grooves.
Okay. I thought it was interesting. You had a really great debate that I want to point our listeners to. I think I'm doing this from memory, but I think it was May 6th, 2023 with Justin Schieber, co-host of Real Atheology. And consciousness was one of the topics that both of you tackled. And he had a really interesting take, particularly in the Crossfire or regarding this idea that he acknowledged consciousness. But it was almost like, and I know you'll be able to speak to this better than I, because to be honest with you, I did have a bit of a hard time following it, which is why I'm asking you about it. It was almost like ontologically necessary, maybe, or just the kind of the foundational thing. But I might be mischaracterizing that. I don't know, which is why I wanted to ask you. So what did you think of his take on consciousness, and what ramifications did it have for his atheism and your theism?
Yeah, so Justin Schieber was a naturalist. Not all atheists are naturalists.
Right.
Schieber was one, and a certain kind of naturalist. Nevertheless, he held to a type of something called panpsychism. That's another fun thing, is when you start studying these things, you learn about all these new words. And there's a lot to say here, and it's very telling. So I'll start with this. What is panpsychism? Just like pantheism, pan meaning all or throughout all. Panpsychism, pan, all or throughout all, and psyche, a soul or mind, is essentially the idea that there are conscious bits of matter in every piece of physical parts. In every molecule, there are potential conscious bits. And this is going to be a good segue to the next question of what am I? And think of like Legos. If you put enough of these conscious physical things together, you'll eventually get consciousness squirting into existence. And so on the panpsychist view, every material thing literally has the potentiality to become conscious if put in the right physical structure. So your desk, your headphones. One of the great things about learning philosophy is you get to appreciate a new kind of memes. And if you type in like panpsychism memes, you find that people get like those googly eyes that you can find at craft stores, and they put them on like their toaster and their desk and like, their refrigerator, and it's panpsychism. So fascinating. For the panpsychist, here's why I'd say it's telling. For the longest time, and atheist John Sorrell alluded to this. He is a really good atheist philosopher of mind. And he says a lot of the philosophy of mind that's been written in the past 50 years is really just trash. My paraphrase, but not that far off from what he says. And he said something like, at first they were telling us consciousness is physical. And then they told us consciousness is not physical, and so it must not exist. And now they're telling us it does exist. It's not physical, and it is not physical, but it's just fundamental to reality. In other words, it's becoming more and more of a problem. In fact, so much so that I think if there are any aspiring apologists out there, I would highly encourage you to get into and learn some philosophy of mind, because I think that is where the next kalam, if you will, is going to come from, is from philosophy of mind. And what they're essentially doing is they're starting to realize we have to do something with consciousness. And as we argued, a lot of atheists have realized that if it's not physical, it can't exist on a strict naturalist view. And some philosophers will bite the bullet, pay the price tag, and say consciousness does not exist. The irony there is if you say consciousness does not exist, then you're saying something similar to saying beliefs don't exist. So if you say, if physicalism is true, beliefs don't exist. However, I believe this, therefore beliefs do exist, therefore consciousness exists, therefore physicalism cannot be true. So it becomes self-defeating.
Yeah.
For the panpsychists, what they now do is say, okay, maybe it can't just pop up by rearranging physical matter. So what we have to do is front load it from the beginning and say it's just always been there. And under the right conditions, it will pop in, it will arise a single conscious subject. Why is this telling? Because one, it's like the philosophy is twisting their arm to admit you cannot get consciousness from matter. Thomas Nagel, another atheist philosopher, argued this in his book, Mind and Cosmos. And two, it tells us that they are starting to realize that because you cannot get consciousness from matter, it has to be fundamental to reality. Well, what does that start to sound like? Here's what I pointed out to Justin Schieber in my debate. I said, so you agree that consciousness is fundamental? He said, yes, it seems like it has to be. And I said, well, then why not just become a Christian? Because that's exactly the heart of the Christian worldview, that everything comes from mind, namely God's mind. And so God is fundamental to reality. It's like, yes and amen, just take a few more steps. So, to all the panpsychists out there, bless your heart. You are giving it the best shot you can. It's just one of those things that becomes so ad hoc, and it's just like, wow, you're getting so close to the right side, just keep pushing a little bit further. So that's essentially what the panpsychists would argue, that consciousness is already fundamental. It's already there. You just need to put it in the right conditions for it to kind of spring up, if you will.
That's good. Yeah. I thought that part of the discussion was one of the most interesting and for reasons that you've just pointed out, one of the more telling, because I was much like you and I even like how you pointed out, how doesn't this challenge kind of the idea of simplicity, which I thought that was helpful. But I also and this is a side note from our topic today, but I also found it really interesting how you were pointing to moral obligation, and he was kind of trying to say that obligations are enough. And you were trying to point out that, but we're only obligated to persons. And I thought that, because you can't be obligated to obligations. So that's a very crude, kind of quick and dirty way of putting it. But I thought those 2 points were really powerful in the crossfire.
And that's another thing he was conceding, as you said, this being a side note, is he just like naturalists are starting to realize they're going to have to do something with consciousness and they can no longer call it physical. The same it's become the same for moral properties and values. So someone like Eric Willenberg has really made this popular. So for the longest time, and a really good book I would highly recommend is Adam Johnson's book. It's called Divine Love Theory, Adam Johnson. And he really, I think, takes Willenberg to task and points out the flaws in his view. But Willenberg says, yes, moral values exist. No, they're not physical, but they are necessary. And what's really fascinating, this is why I say philosophy of mind is where it's at and where it's going to be. In order for Willenberg to argue for the existence of these immaterial moral properties, he literally says this in his writing. He says, well, let's just pull a page from the philosophy of mind area. And just like they can get consciousness from matter because it's already there, maybe we can do the same thing with moral properties. And that's essentially what he argues. So it's a really interesting, it's like the same move being done in a different area. But yeah, another one of those areas where if you're going to concede these things, you're losing out on simplicity. You're what's called bloating your ontology. You're adding these things to your worldview that doesn't seem to fit naturally in them.
Yeah. And I wonder too, with those 2 points, that you made there and how they're connected, obviously, would you go as far as saying that this may be in some cases just evidence of how people are willing to entertain kind of any explanation as long as it's not a theistic one?
Oh, absolutely. Same thing. Kind of, it reminds me of like the multiverse. I don't know if it was John Lennox or Craig who first said this. When you talk about fine tuning, they posit, well, maybe there's a multiverse and we just happen to live in the one that's fine tuned. And either Lennox or Craig said something like, so you're telling me that in order to eliminate the existence of one God, you have to posit the existence of an infinite amount of universes.
Yes.
And you think your explanation is a more simple one.
Yeah. I've heard Richard Swinburne say something like that as well. So yeah. Well, thanks. I was just curious about that. So we've talked a lot about kind of your first contention in the chapter. Consciousness is not physical. When you were kind of giving the overview in the beginning, you also talked about, and you have throughout, am I more than a brain and body? So do you want to talk more about that?
Yeah. So thus far we've established consciousness is not physical.
Right.
So we've answered the first question. What is consciousness? It's an immaterial state of the mind or soul. Now, the next question becomes, okay, what kind of thing in mind? Here's a segue, is that given that these conscious states and properties exist, we now have to ask, what is a thing that grounds or possesses or owns them? And here's why this is important. whenever properties show up in the world, like take the property of redness, they don't just float around in the world, just existing. They're always grounded or possessed by something. So when I get on the freeway, I don't try to avoid hitting the property of redness. Instead, I try to avoid hitting objects that possess the property of redness. So the same thing would be true for conscious states and properties. What is a thing that possesses and grounds them? Well, I think we can all agree that for each person, you can say, I possess my conscious states and properties. Moreland once said something he says a lot of profound things that are so simple but profound. He said, thoughts have thinkers. Thoughts don't just float around by themselves. They're always grounded in a conscious subject. So I own and ground my mental states and properties, but then the question naturally arises, what kind of thing am I? Okay, now here's where it gets a little bit more technical with the metaphysics, but not hard to follow at all. The terminology is, I'm either an immaterial soul, an immaterial substance, and we described what that is. I am the thing that grounds my mental states and properties and everything else about me, and I unify them into one thing. I'm either an immaterial soul, or I am what you would call in philosophy a mereological aggregate, but we're just going to call it aggregate for short.
Right.
What is an aggregate? An aggregate is a collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure. So things like watches, Lego bricks, or cars are what we call aggregates. They are a collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure. And there are certain features of aggregates that we can learn to identify them by. So one important thing is that for aggregates, their existence and identity is dependent necessarily on the parts and structure. What do we mean by that? A quick thought experiment. If I remove a tire from a car, it remains a tire because its existence and identity is not dependent on its connection to the car as a whole. So for aggregates, the whole depends on the parts. Contrast that with substances. For substances, the parts depend on the whole. Here's what an example Aristotle used. If I cut off my arm, then it will lose its identity as a human arm, which is evident by the fact that within a few days it will decay and cease to exist. So my parts are dependent on their connection to me, whereas for aggregates, their parts exist independent of their connection to the whole. Another quick thought experiment, take a tricycle. A tricycle is what it is in virtue of the fact that it has 3 wheels. But if you remove just one wheel from a tricycle, then we can say that in a metaphysical sense, a tricycle has ceased to exist and a bicycle has come into existence. We'll unpack some of this more, but the point is simply this, is that for aggregates, their existence and identity necessarily depends on their part and structure. By contrast, if you chop off my hands, I'm still Eric Hernandez because I don't depend on my parts depend on me. Okay, so with this in mind, and again, using Leibniz's law of identity, I'll give 3 brief arguments for the notion that I am more than a brain and body, I am a soul. We can start off each argument with this premise. I am either a purely physical object, an aggregate, or an immaterial soul. So the first argument we can talk about is identity through change and part replacement. So another thought experiment. Have you seen the show WandaVision, that Marvel show?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, trick question. That's not a Christian show, so I got you.
Yes.
No, it's a good show. One of the last episodes, spoiler alert to anyone who hasn't seen it, you have 2 visions. And what's interesting is they begin to talk about what's called the ship of Theseus, which is a thought experiment in philosophy of mind. And I give a modern version, and I just use a car, and I modify it because I think the way I modify it helps the point come across clear. So let's say you have a car, and I start by doing this. I ask the person, if I replace the tires on this car, is it the same car? Now, whatever your answer is, let's now suppose I replace every single nut and bolt, everything, the windshield, bumper, every single thing on the car. Is it the same car? But then before you answer that question, here's where I modify it. Let's take the replaced parts and put those back together, and now we have 2 cars. Now the question we can ask is, which one of these 2 cars, if any, is the original? And regardless of your answer there, I think one thing is clear. They both cannot be the original. And what I think this shows us is that when it comes to purely physical objects, aggregates, they do not retain identity through change and part replacement. They do not remain the same object. Okay, with this in mind, we can now do this argument. I am either a purely physical object or an immaterial soul. If I am a purely physical object, I do not retain identity through part replacement and change. But I do retain identity through part replacement and change. Therefore, I'm not a purely physical object. Therefore, I am a soul. Let's unpack that. Take something like, let's say, any kind of physical object. Again, like we talked about the tricycle. You remove one wheel, it's no longer a tricycle. Now, we know that, we know now through science that we replace virtually every cell in our body every 7 to 10 years. Now, if physicalism is true, and I'm identical to a brain and body, then after part replacement and change, there's a new brain and body, thus a new person. So imagine 7 to 10 years ago, I commit a crime. This is not me admitting to any guilt or anything. It's just a thought experiment.
Sure.
You got to watch out when you talk about these philosophical thought experiments in public. And let's say I get a knock on my door and it's J. Warner Wallace. And he says, we just found the evidence to convict you of a crime you committed 7 to 10 years ago. Would it make sense for me to look at him and say, Jay, come on, you know that we're just purely physical objects and we replace parts every 7 to 10 years. And so the person you're looking for is someone else that existed 7 to 10 years ago. Go find them, but good luck because they no longer exist.
Right.
Well, no, he's going to laugh and slap the cuffs on me. Why?
Right. Nor
because
would that
we know
work.
that human beings.
Sorry, I was just
right.
going to say, nor would that work in a court of law.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because we know intuitively human beings retain identity through change or part replacement. And thus, if I retain identity through change and part replacement, then I can't be a purely physical object. Thus, I must be a soul. Jaegwon Kim, I don't know if I put this in the chapter because I only had so many words.
Sure.
Jaegwon Kim, an atheist philosopher of mine, he gives a similar argument. He's not a dualist, but he's going through the dualist arguments, and I like his. He says something like this: in 2001, this brain and body did not exist. However, I did exist in 2001. Thus, I cannot be identical or divisible to this brain and body. Okay, so that's the first argument.
I like that.
Identity through change. The second one is known as the indivisibility of personhood. What does that mean? Again, with terminology, first, philosophers distinguish between what are called degreed and non-degreed properties. A degreed property is something that can fluctuate and change and exist in percentages or degrees. So, for example, the properties being loud or heavy or soft can, again, be divided or exist in percentages or degrees. A sound can be louder or softer. Weights can be heavier or lighter. And, textures, again, can be softer or harder. So these are degreed properties. By contrast, non-degreed properties are properties that that cannot exist in percentages or degrees. They're what we call all or nothing kind of properties. They either exist or not exist, but there is no in between to them. So, for example, the number 2 and the number 6 are both even. So let's talk about the property of being even. The number 2 and the number 6 are both even numbers, but it makes no sense to say that the number 6 is, quote, more even than the number 2.
Sure.
Why? Well, because evenness is not a degreed property. It either is or it isn't. There is no in between. Okay. With this in mind, now let's think of purely physical objects. If I were to cut a table in half, it would make sense to say that I have 50% of a table. So for purely physical objects, they can exist in percentages and degrees. But note how the same thing cannot be said of a person. So if you were to sever my limbs, then you could honestly say I have 50% of a body, but note you could not in the same breath say that I am therefore 50% of a person.
That's fascinating.
Why? Because while my body can exist in percentages or degrees, I cannot because I'm an all or nothing kind of thing. Now, this has huge implications to so many areas. But to just, before going there, so here's the argument in a syllogism. I'm either a purely physical object, aggregate, or a soul, a material substance. Purely physical objects can be divided and exist in percentages or degrees. I cannot be divided or exist in percentages or degrees because I'm an all or nothing kind of thing. Therefore, I'm not a purely physical object. Therefore, I'm a soul. So you have, even if someone wants to say, what's your brain that is, that's where your personhood is at? Well, same thing. You can have operations where they remove, let's say, 30% of your brain. But does that make you 70% person? No. While you may lose functioning, you don't lose personhood. And here's where the implications comes in, even with ethics. Think about the question of abortion. Well, sure, the unborn are smaller than us, but here's the big overall question. Does having more mass and matter mean that you matter more? Well, no. Men are typically larger than women, but no one would say that men are more valuable or more persons than women. Why? Because your personhood is not grounded in the amount of mass or matter that you have. So an interesting implication is that if physicalism is true, you have to ground your value as a person because personhood is going to be grounded in the physical makeup, your brain and body, which would have to imply that the more mass and matter you have, the more valuable of a person you are. But again, we know that's intuitively not true. Thus, if I cannot be divided and physical objects can, then physicalism can't be true and I must be a soul.
Wow. That's really good. Very clear, very helpful. Love that.
All right. So the last one is an argument from free will. What is free will? In a nutshell, I would define free will is the view that I am the first mover or source of my will or action. For example, if I lift my arm to vote and I was the one that lifted my arm, then you could say I had free will. And more specifically, for the listeners, what you call libertarian free will, but we're just going to call it free will for short.
Sure.
By contrast, if you shock me with a taser and that makes my arm go up, then I was caused by something external and prior to myself, which means I was not the first mover, and thus I did not have, that wasn't a free will or a free action. All right. Now, if physicalism is true, then human freedom becomes impossible because the consequence of physicalism and the worldview of naturalism is that determinism is going to be true. What is determinism? Essentially the view that all thoughts, beliefs, desires, sensations, and actions of human beings are causally determined by prior factors, external and beyond their control. So if we're reducible to purely physical properties and parts, as the physicalists would have us to believe, then all our actions are determined by the laws of chemistry and physics. In other words, physical objects don't act on their own, but are caused to act by something external and prior to themselves. So, water does not freely choose to freeze at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. A bullet cannot choose to disobey Newton's laws of motion and swerve left instead of go up. And you don't put $1 into a Coke machine and expect it to choose to sing you a song instead of give you a Coke. This is because purely physical objects, again, do not freely move or act on their own, but are causally determined to act based on the inputs and outputs of their, physical makeup. Okay, so here's the syllogism. I'm either a purely physical object or an immaterial soul. If I'm a purely physical object, I do not possess free will. I do possess free will, therefore I'm not a purely physical object, therefore I am a soul. Now, here's a thought experiment that I believe Aristotle again used this. He says, if I move a rock with my staff, then we can say that the staff moved the rock, my hand moved the staff, but then we have to ask the question, what moved me? Now, in order for libertarian free will to exist here, I have to be the first mover. Now, let's see how a physicalist would have to answer this if they want to hold on to free will. Well, first, they're going to have to show us that the moving of the hand and the staff and the rock was caused by you when you were the first mover. Now, what they would typically, when I ask people this, they'll typically say, well, neurons firing are in my brain. It starts with me, and thus I'm the first mover, thus I have free will. But here's a problem. Without going into all the details, if physicalism is true and naturalism is true and there is no God, then something known as a law of causal closure would have to be true. What is the law of causal closure? It's essentially the law that every physical event must necessarily have a prior physical cause. So every physical event is going to have a prior physical cause. Mm-hmm. So note when the physicalist says, well, neurons in my brain cause my hand to move, cause the staff to move, cause a rock to move, they're pointing to a physical event. And if their worldview is true, then given the law of causal closure, they now need a physical explanation for that neuron firing. Well, at this point, they have two options, both of which will make free will impossible. The first option is to say, well, a different group of neurons firing caused that first set of neurons firing. Okay, fine. But again, it's a physical event, and thus you now need another physical cause. And what they'll eventually find out is that this leads into an infinite regress where the rock will never move. But given that the rock did move, then it follows that that option isn't available. So we cannot use the infinite regress. The second option is they can posit however many sets of neurons firing in their brain, but at some point, they're going to have to point to something external and prior to and beyond the person's control that made that neuron firing, that made the hand move, made the staff move, made the rock move. But note now they're having to point to external factors, which means they are no longer the first mover, but intermediate secondary movers, and thus that eliminates the possibility of free will. So the only thing that could even allow free will is if I am not a purely physical object determined by the laws of chemistry and physics, but if I am something that transcends the physical and that has the power to act as a first mover on the physical, namely the soul.
What I've noticed in debates and discussions of this nature with atheists, and when these tensions are brought up between this idea of, well, if physicalism is true, determinism is true. Therefore, how can we have free choices? This even has moral implications, of course, is when one says, well, how are you going to prosecute somebody if they had no choice but to do what they did, right? But they not always, but many times, for example, I'm thinking of Michael Shermer. He would punt to compatibilism. And now I personally can't get my mind around compatibilism in the sense of I don't see how it solves a problem. But I'm thinking of an atheist listening to this right now saying, oh, well, I'm a compatibilist. So that really kind of solves the tension between this idea that our choices still matter, but that determinism is true. Am I characterizing that correctly? And then if so, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's nonsense. Compatibilism is literally known as soft determinism. So compatibilism is a type of determinism. And it is essentially the view that determinism and free will are compatible. Now, each compatibilist is going to, well, not each, but, there are a variety of compatibilists who will explain this differently.
Sure.
On a popular level, it's essentially, they will argue that your will and actions are necessarily caused by your greatest desires. And they think that this helps them, it saves them, because they say, well, if my desires are in me and that's what causes my action, then I'm the first mover. But here's a problem with that. Oh. It's a bait and switch. To explain it one more time in a different way, sure, I may be caused to, lift up my arm, but guess what? I want to lift up my arm. So I'm being caused to do what I already want to do. So what's the big deal if I want to do it? Or think of this way.
See, that's sorry to interrupt, but that's where my brain goes, what? Like that just doesn't connect. But anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry. I didn't mean.
That's where your mind goes left.
Exactly.
Yes. So think if you were to buy a plane ticket and get on the plane, then the speed of the plane, maybe even where you will sit, and the time you will arrive at your destination is all causally determined, and you cannot do anything else. But guess what? It doesn't matter because that's what you want to do, so you're still free to do it even though you cannot do otherwise. That gets a little more technical, but let's just here's where the problem. Here's where this runs into the problem. Mm-hmm. On compatibilism, although we could say, let's just grant that your actions are necessarily caused by your greatest desire. The problem is your greatest desires are themselves causally determined. So the reason I say it's a bait and switch is because they're essentially saying this: I am free to do whatever it is that I was causally determined to do in the first place, and I'm going to do what I want. And while I am free to do what I want, here's a problem. You're not free to want to begin with. So if my wants and desires are causally determined by external factors beyond my control, then I cannot be held accountable for anything that I want. Just like a magnet cannot be, or a piece of metal cannot be held accountable for its attraction to a magnet, a person cannot be held accountable for their attractions, as immoral as they may be.
That's good. That's good.
So here's where now, and this is a good segue, because now what I often have sometimes, well, not often, depends on who I'm talking to. People will say, well, I just deny free will. And if they take that route, then here's where I extend the argument a little bit. If they're going to deny free will, then two price tags arise. And in philosophy, price tags are the intellectual price you have to pay to deny something.
Yeah, and
in order for someone to be logically consistent.
Yeah, and I love how you explained this in the chapter and repeatedly show the price tag throughout. That was, particularly toward the end of the essay, it was really helpful.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. So the two price tags are going to be a price tag of intellectual integrity and moral responsibility. So let's start with moral responsibility. Okay, if they want to deny the soul for this argument, they have to deny free will. Okay, let's start with this. If external factors beyond your control causally determine your beliefs, behaviors, and decisions, then no one could ever be held morally responsible for their actions. So imagine a murder in which a gun was used. Now, let's look at the chain of events. We see that the gun fired the bullet. The bullet is actually what penetrated the victim's heart, and it's actually the bullet that killed them and caused a person's death. But note that although the bullet was a direct cause of death, we don't blame the bullet. Why? Because it did not act or move on its own. It was caused to fire by the gun. So now let's go back one step. Do we blame the gun? No. Or it depends who you vote for. But no, we should not blame the gun because we know the gun did not act on its own, but was caused by the firing of the trigger, which was pulled by the person. And we assume that persons were the first movers in this chain of events and thus hold them morally accountable. However, if human beings are purely physical objects, then much like the gun or bullet, the person becomes nothing more than an intermediate secondary mover in this causal chain of events. In other words, if determinism is true, because there is no free will, even if they want to call it compatibilism, then the person didn't choose to act on their own, but like their gun or bullet, was causally determined to act by some prior event beyond their control. So simply put, if we cannot blame the gun or bullet because they were intermediate secondary movers, then we cannot blame the person either. All three were purely physical objects, neither of which was a source of their actions, and thus neither can be held morally accountable.
Wow.
So here's a price tag. If physicalism is true, determinism is true. If determinism is true, human beings are not morally responsible for their actions. But we know that human beings are morally responsible for their actions. Therefore, determinism is false, and thus physicalism is false as well. Now, with the second one, the price tag of intellectual integrity. Now, by intellectual integrity, I mean that a person has come to believe something based on the evidence in a rationally responsible way. That one's beliefs were formed through a process of rigorous research, analyzing the evidence, and then freely coming to one's own logical conclusion. And if someone does this, then they can claim a sense of intellectual integrity for their beliefs, whether they're atheists or Christians or whatever. But note how this notion of intellectual integrity assumes that in some sense, people are rationally responsible for their beliefs and had the freedom to come to these beliefs in the first place. However, again, if physicalism is true, then, and if naturalism does not allow for the possibility of human freedom, then it cannot by default allow for the possibility of intellectual integrity or rational responsibility either. So if all my thoughts and actions are causally determined, then here's the irony is, because some atheists like to say that, they're the rational ones, they're the intellectually superior ones.
Sure.
But if all these things are determined, then being an atheist is no different than having blue eyes or green eyes. You didn't do anything to earn that. It's something that was biologically or physically determined by factors beyond your control. And if that's the case, you cannot claim a sense of rational superiority or responsibility for your thoughts, which means that the non-believer in this scenario is no more intellectual or no more rational than the religious nut who's yelling on the street corner. Wow. They're both causally determined to believe what they do, and neither is responsible for that. Here's another piece of irony. Atheists like to typically call themselves free thinkers, which means they're enlightened and unbound and not brainwashed by the shackles of religion because they are free to think for themselves. But if the atheist holds to physicalism and acknowledges that free will does not exist, then they must equally acknowledge that none of their thoughts or beliefs were ever free to begin with. However, if none of their thoughts or beliefs were ever free to begin with, then ironically, by their own standards, the last thing they could possibly call themselves is a free thinker. So in a syllogism, if atheism is true, free will does not exist. But because of the evidence, I freely chose to become an atheist. Therefore, free will exists. Therefore, atheism is false. And thus, we see consciousness is not physical, which answers the first question, what is consciousness? What is the I or self? Well, we saw three arguments that I am not identical to my brain and body. Identity through change. Physical objects don't retain identity through change. I do. Indivisibility of personhood. Physical objects can exist in percentages or degrees, but I'm an all or nothing kind of thing. And three, the argument from free will. Purely physical objects don't have free will, but I do. And if someone wants to reject free will, well, they also have to reject moral responsibility and intellectual integrity. And here's something that I've always found ironic that I don't think I included this in the book, but in the book, The Lazy Approach to Evangelism, A Simple Guide for Conversing with Non-Believers, I go into a little more of the implications. Is I've always found it ironic when an atheist argues with me that there is no free will. Because note that by doing that, they are assuming that I have the free will to listen to them and change my mind.
Yeah.
But if I don't have the free will to change my mind to begin with, then it is utterly pointless to try and change my mind on the question of whether or not free will exists. So it becomes self-defeating. Sam Harris wrote a book on free will, arguing that there is no free will. Well, why would he do that if we don't have the freedom to change our minds? Maybe he was just hoping we would be determined to buy it and just believe him. I don't know. But note the irony in all of this. And so, well, there's lots more we can say. As the title implies, given all this, I simply don't have enough faith to be a physicalist.
That's good stuff. Well, you mentioned J.P. Moreland a lot, and as you were going through those prices to pay, if you will, for holding to this idea these false ideas is I keep thinking about how Moreland will repeatedly point out how there are certain views that people claim they hold, but the way they live betrays something else. And, you know, obviously you can deny that we have free will, but everybody lives as if we do.
I once heard, I forget what book it is, but it was a chapter on free will. And in the book, it says, if you don't think we have free will, turn to page 52. And you turn to page 52 and it says, gotcha.
I love that. That's outstanding. Well, hey, this has been absolutely outstanding. Exactly what I wanted. You just have given us such a great overview. And of course, I want to point people to the book to learn more. But before that, you said something during the interview that you said philosophy of mind is where it's at. And you also encouraged people who were getting into apologetics to start pursuing this area. So before you tell us where to find your stuff, I was wondering if somebody was listening and they were all on board and they're like, okay, I want to learn more about philosophy of mind. Where would be a good place to start other than, of course, your essay? That's a given.
Oh, yeah, of course. And other than the lazy approach to evangelism. Yeah.
Right.
Depends on how much they know about philosophy in general, because there are certain principles that one needs to know. But two great resources. One, J.P. Moreland has a short book called The Soul, How We Know It's Real and Why It Matters. I prefer the thicker version, which is more of it's a little bit more academic, but he explains it so well and he defines it. I mean, you may have to read it a few times, but I mean,
sure.
We should love God with our minds, right?
Amen.
It's called Body and Soul, Human Nature and the Crisis in Ethics. And it's co-written with Scott B. Ray, who's a philosopher and an ethicist. And the first half is the philosophy of mind stuff. It's going to give you what you need, the different views of physicalism, why they fell. It's going to break down in much more detail, you know, what I broke down when it comes to substances, properties, things of that nature. And then what I like about this is that it goes into the ethical implications. Again, so you're talking about abortion, euthanasia, in vitro fertilization, all these things that are relevant to what is a person and personhood. Because this will take us much deeper, so I won't go too much into this, but suffice to say that my soul is what grounds my essence, my nature. And so I'll open just this brief can of worms. Everything that is conscious, given that consciousness is immaterial, everything that is consciousness is going to require a soul. So yes, animals have souls. And whenever I do debates on the soul, I'd say 4 times out of 5, the atheist will ask me, oh, so do animals have souls? And they expect me to say no. And I say yes. And they look surprised. I don't know why they look surprised.
Right.
I mean, if they would just read the Bibles they don't believe in, you know. In Hebrew, in Genesis, when it talks about God creating the land creatures, it says he creates the land nefesh. And that word nefesh is a Hebrew word for soul. Animals are conscious, thus animals have souls. Now, someone might ask, what does that mean animals go to heaven? Without answering that question, I think so, but I'm not a hard position on that.
You just moved up my ladder of favorite apologists. Thank you. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, there you go. Thank you.
I mean, you were already moving up, but you just went up a couple rungs really quickly when you said animals go to heaven. Anyway, go ahead.
Oh, very nice.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. Usually Christians ask me, does that mean animals have souls? The reason I go to heaven. The reason I point that out is because note the implication. Christians typically assume, if you were to ask your average Christian what is a soul, they might say something like, oh, it's the thing that goes to heaven. My goodness, it is so much more than that. And it is not, and souls by their very nature don't go to heaven. God is not obliged to send a soul to heaven. That's another deeper theological discussion. But nevertheless, if you assume all the soul is a thing that goes to heaven, my goodness, there is so much you're missing out on. And again, maybe we'll have to do another show, but this gets into spiritual formation. This gets into anxiety, depression, OCD. This gets into spiritual disciplines. This gets into Romans 7, where Paul says, what I want to do, I don't do. And what I don't want to do, I end up doing. And I've discovered that there's nothing good within myself. And then he clarifies, that is my flesh. And then he makes this distinction between the inner man and his flesh and this war between his soul and body. So you have Paul making substance dualist distinctions between his body and him, the self, and how that plays into sin, spiritual formation, sanctification. This is why our bodies are living sacrifices. He says, I beat my body into submission. This is why fasting is important, because your soul is essentially telling your body, I know you're hungry, but shut up. I tell you when to eat. You don't tell me when to eat. And thus we are building our inner man and weakening the desire and will of our flesh, because there is a warring between the soul and flesh.
Wow.
And no, this doesn't go into Gnosticism, because I've had people bring that up. People say, but if you're going to make this, distinction between the body and soul, how do you avoid Gnosticism? And my answer is always the same, and it's pretty simple. I avoid Gnosticism by not being a Gnostic. You just don't do it. I mean, I don't know what
that's
the
good
big deal
advice.
is.
I mean,
That's right. So we can say that I am a soul. I have a body. It's biblical. That would be an entire other discussion, fascinating one too. But it shows that if there's more to us than the physical, then naturalism, physicalism cannot be true, and there is an immaterial world, and it is foundational to reality. His name is God, and you should get to know him.
That's so good. Good stuff. And real quick, I would just add to your list of resources, if I may be so bold, the first place I started to get my mind around the soul and philosophy of mind and stuff like that was actually J.P. Moreland's interview with Lee Strobel in The Case for the Creator. That's kind of a smaller bite-sized bit that somebody could get their teeth around initially, but those other resources obviously are going to give them much more than what you'd find there.
That is actually a great recommendation. Just go online and look up Moreland's, Moreland stuff. That's how I started, before I'm willing to, pay my hard-earned money, to buy the books. I want to see what this guy has to say. And yeah, I have probably listened to everything I could find online of Moreland, especially when he talks about the soul.
Yeah.
My channel, this segues into what you're asking, where they can find me. Just type in Eric Hernandez in YouTube or youtube.com/Eric Hernandez. One of the few Mexicans on YouTube doing apologetics, so it shouldn't be hard to find. And I have a lot of debates, not just on God, but a lot on the soul, debates on consciousness. I always bring the soul and consciousness into my debates, even if it's on God, because of what we talked about here, the implications. But yeah, lots on my channel on there. Again, anything Moreland puts out there is going to be gold as well. But yeah, find me on YouTube. You can, as I said, I work with Texas Baptists. You can go to texasapologetics.org.
Okay.
I'm in charge of doing 3 annual conferences around the state of Texas, and we've had everyone from William Lane Craig, we've had J.P. Moreland, even Frank Turek, Greg Kokel at our conferences. Our next one's in El Paso. We'll have David Wood. He'll be one of our keynotes. Awesome guy, great story. And then we'll have one in the Dallas area at the end of this year. Just go to, again, texasapologetics.org, and you can check it out there. You can also go to erichernandezministries.com. I don't keep up with it as much. I've been with Texas Baptist for about 6 years. And before that, I was working like 3 or 4 or 5 jobs. That's a whole other story.
Wow.
And when I started getting donations, I needed to get a 501c3, and that included a website. I'm not very creative, so they asked me, what do you want to call the website? And I said, Eric Hernandez, I guess. And they're like, how about Eric Hernandez Ministries? I'm like, sure. But yeah, you can find stuff on there, some articles, and it'll also link you to the book and to my YouTube page as well.
Excellent. Well, Eric Hernandez, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been a delight.
Hey, thank you.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast. We also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice. And please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Otten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.